that it has become lately because of COVID-19, but it was before and it will be again. So before we get into the questions, Diane, I'm wondering if there is something that you want to say in the way of opening remarks before questions and dialogue.
Well, I'll just say thanks, Congressman Heck, for the opportunity to be here. To introduce maybe our organization a little bit. So the National Low Income Housing Coalition is a membership organization, and we're dedicated to achieving socially just public policy that ensures that the lowest income people have affordable, accessible, and safe homes. And these days our work is all about trying to avoid this tremendous eviction crisis that we're staring down, and very grateful, Congressman Heck, for your leadership on advancing solutions to avoid that terrible eviction crisis. And looking forward to talking about some of those solutions with you.
Great, let's get started, Lauren.
Great. Our first question comes from Sarah in Spanaway and was sent in through constituent mail. With many of us unable to go back to work yet and still waiting on unemployment, landlords are not really wanting to work with us. They demand rent on August 1st, knowing we can't pay, so threaten massive late fees and eviction. Will the eviction moratorium be extended again to help so many of us facing homelessness and the stress around rental assistance programs? Congressman Heck?
Well, at the federal level, TBD, to be determined. Obviously, the eviction moratorium that was adopted in the earlier act was done so for those properties which have federal backed securities and didn't apply to all properties. However, at the state level, Governor Inslee did in fact adopt an eviction moratorium and recently extended it, as a matter of fact. You know, there's something about the tyranny of the calendar. Come the first of the month, which we're now just a few days away from, that rent comes due, and it doesn't matter what else is happening in the world, that rent comes due. And we are seeing a spike in very serious circumstances here. I think it was just last month, some 30% of renters were unable to pay their entire rent, and 20% weren't able to pay any rent whatsoever. So we are on the brink here now that the federal eviction moratorium has been allowed to expire, at least in other states where governors haven't, or local mayors or city councils haven't adopted an eviction moratorium. A lot of people are staring out over the abyss and their toes are out over that space. Diane?
Yeah, I would just say to the questioner that you're not alone. There's a lot of people throughout the country that are facing the same challenges that you are. And I think, you know, to really recognize just how significant the crisis is now, I think we have to recognize where we were even before COVID-19 came to our country. And that was in the middle of a severe affordable housing crisis, where we had a shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income people. So another way of saying that same number is that for every 10 of the lowest income renters, there were fewer than 4 apartments affordable and available to them. So because we had such a tremendous shortage of homes affordable to low income people, we had over 8 million of the lowest income families paying at least half of their income towards rent each month. And many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income to keep a roof over their heads. And when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying so much of it for your home, you're always one financial emergency away from missing rent and potentially being evicted, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. So for many people, for many of these same families, the coronavirus is that financial emergency. You're losing jobs, you're losing hours at work, you're losing wages, and it's harder than ever to cobble together what's needed to make rent. And as you said, in many cases, people aren't receiving unemployment insurance. The extended unemployment insurance has been very important, and it's kept a lot of renters housed and prevented a lot of evictions, but it's not enough on its own. And that's because there's millions of people, like it sounds like the person who asked this question, who hasn't received unemployment insurance. And there's millions more who haven't lost their job entirely, but they've lost hours at work and now have reduced wages. And when it was so hard to make rent before COVID-19, now with reduced wages and increased costs for childcare or healthcare, it's harder than ever. So those eviction moratoriums are essential. Emergency rental assistance is essential. And we're working here in DC with champions like Congressman Heck to try to get the Congress to act and provide these solutions to prevent evictions and potentially a spike in homelessness across the country.
So much to unpack there, Diane. By way of background, however, there was a significant hit of Nigerian-based fraudsters who were actually able to penetrate our state's unemployment insurance system. And in fact, it was initially estimated that there were something north of $600 million in fraudulent claims collected. About half or more have been retrieved since then. But as a consequence of that massive attack on our system, the Department of Employment Security in Washington State had to implement some measures which slowed down the granting of unemployment insurance. So the woman in Spanaway may be one of those who still hasn't received her first unemployment compensation check as a consequence of the measures that had to be adopted in order to weed out the people perpetrating fraud. And it's just when you stop and think about how many months have gone by and how dire their situation, it is just absolutely heartbreaking. We are told this morning by the governor's office that we're down to about 13,000 families, and that they hope and expect that within the week that virtually all of those will be dealt with. So it's not absolutely unique to Washington State. Other states got hit too. Washington State seemed to have been hit particularly hard. Diane, you made some mention of the statistics associated with people who have struggled to pay rent and who pay such a significant percent of their income toward rent. In fact, the Department of Housing and Urban Development has a standard, do they not? And when a person exceeds that standard of percent of income going to rent, they are deemed cost burden. Would you describe that a little bit for people? Diane seems to have frozen. Hopefully we will get her back in the not too distant future. Diane is frozen.
In the meantime, we do have a follow-up to the first question from one of our live viewers. Sarah asked on Facebook Live, what can people do to make sure Congress helps renters? Congressman Heck?
Sarah, thank you so much for the question. This is a battle that I have been fighting for months. When the virus first hit, I knew that this was going to become a problem. And so we put together a bill that provided $100 billion in rent relief to people who found them in this situation of facing eviction and or homelessness. We were able to include that $100 billion measure in the broader HEROES Act, which the House passed in May and sent to the Senate, but has not yet been acted upon. We even subsequently passed another bill, standalone bill, focused specifically at housing, and it also included that $100 billion, just as a way to put an exclamation point behind the strength of our feelings about the need to provide rent relief, and sent it to the Senate. As you probably know, Sarah, where we are now is waiting for the Senate, frankly, to get its act together and be able to come up with the proposition that they could propose in response to the HEROES Act, so that we might enter into serious negotiations and hopefully would be included rent relief in that final product. But the Senate Majority Caucus is unable to come together behind a proposal as of yet. I frankly am pretty critical of them for waiting since May, waiting until we got past the expiration of unemployment, waiting until we got past the eviction moratorium, and all of these protections designed to keep families whole and well. You know, I have, Sarah, a favorite expression as it relates to housing: pillow, blanket, roof. And what I mean by that is, if somebody doesn't have a pillow to lay their head on at night, a blanket to keep them warm, and a roof over their head to keep the rain off them, then any other issue that may be confronting them in their life won't be successfully dealt with, whether that's mental health or substance abuse or just plain lack of work. The fact of the matter is that there are millions of Americans who are confronting eviction. There are millions of Americans who are going to find the very cold, hard reality of the August 1st rent due, resulting in them being displaced. And many of them will become homeless. Nobody wins if that's the case. Nobody. So that was the reason why that we proposed the rental assistance bill and ensured that the House passed it. So hopefully the Senate will take it up. They have not included it at all in the general outline of what they have suggested they would propose going forward. But then again, they haven't been able to pass what they've said they want to yet either. We have a very long way to go. We will not give up this fight.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Judith in Lacey, who sent this in through constituent mail. What kind of assistance is being made to help the owners of the rental properties who have payments to make on the properties they are renting out, where they might not be receiving rent during the moratorium?
Did you say that was from Judith, Lauren?
Yes.
Great question, Judith. That actually is the purpose of the rent relief bill, to keep renters in their apartments, and actually the payments would go directly to the landlords once the tenant has been checked off by the local housing authority or some such entity to ensure that they qualify. So here's the deal. Unless we want this to become a form of Hunger Games musical chairs, where somebody gets stuck holding the bag and maybe perhaps fatally, then we're going to have to make sure everybody gets made whole or well until we get through this COVID-19 crisis. And what I mean by that is, if we just provided eviction moratorium and said, okay, landlords, you can't kick anybody out, whether or not they pay their bills, because we're in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and having more homeless people doesn't help. If that's all we did, we'd just be shifting the problem to the landlords, who oftentimes have mortgage payments to make, and then they're going to get foreclosed on, and the tenant's going to lose their apartment anyway at that stage. So that's why we have the rent relief bill provide the money directly to the landlord, so the landlord can take the mortgage payment and the renter can stay in the apartment. Whether or not we're able to be successful with the Senate is, again, a question to be determined. I think it's also important to put this a little bit in context. Lots of people think about renters as living in multifamily large dwellings, which are owned by national corporations. But the fact of the matter is, about half of all residential rental properties in this country are owned by what I characterize as mom and pops. This is somebody who, in addition to their regular day job, instead of building up a great big 401k account, decides that they're going to save for their retirement and build their own retirement security by accumulating 1 or 2 or 3 duplexes or a small apartment building or a couple of single family rentals here and there. And these are the ones that are going to be stuck with the bill to whomever holds their mortgage if we are not able to provide rent relief. But the problem gets even worse, frankly, in this regard. Apartment or residential properties are usually graded Class A, Class B, Class C. As you might imagine, Class A has the most amenities and charges the most, and so on down the line. Well, it turns out that the Class C properties, which have way more people of lesser income, are owned in disproportionately even higher numbers by mom and pop operations. And they're the ones where it's really going to get binding, because they're the ones that are being impacted the worst and materially hurt the worst by the Great Recession brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. If we do not provide rent relief, it's a double whammy on both low-income people or working poor in those apartments and or single-family residences, and the mom and pop landlords who hold them. We have an imperative here to pass this to hold everybody harmless, including those who own these residential units.
Thank you. And we're still working on bringing Diane back on board. So in the meantime, we do have another question from Melinda, who is watching live.
I've never been so glad to see somebody in my life. Do you know how hard it would have been for me to talk for a whole hour? No jokes about politicians. Diane, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I lost my internet. It's pretty stormy over here right now, so I'm hoping this one sticks. I'm sorry for the interruption.
You're welcome back. That's all that matters. Lauren,
Wonderful.
Give Diane a question.
Absolutely. This one comes from Melinda. How can we help Congress understand that allowing people to become homeless and then trying to get them rehoused is far more costly than keeping people in their homes? Diane?
Yes, it's such an important point, and it's one we work to get through as often as we can and as well as we can, and we welcome more people sharing the same message. And the message that we often share is that there's so many implications, so many harmful outcomes from evictions. And evictions in the middle of a pandemic aren't just cruel and immoral, they're short-sighted and they're senseless. And especially in a pandemic, evictions risk lives and risk overburdening our already overstretched hospital systems. They make it much more difficult for us to be able to contain the virus. In Columbus, Ohio, for example, they have turned their convention center into an eviction court. And they've done that so that, one, they can manage the influx, the increased evictions, but also because they want to implement social distancing during the proceedings, which to me is just the height of irony, that they're taking care to implement social distancing during a process that is literally about kicking people out of their homes with few options left to them other than doubling or tripling up in overcrowded housing or going into congregate shelter where social distancing is difficult, if not impossible. And as the questioner also raises, the cost implications of this are significant. There's a whole body of research that shows the harm that evictions do. Just one eviction can have a tremendous negative impact on a family's trajectory. It makes it much more difficult for that family to get another landlord to rent to them. So they often end up having to go to poorer neighborhoods or into dilapidated housing because those are the landlords who will rent to them. Evictions harm children's educational outcomes, their health outcomes. It can do harm to people's mental health and physical health. And the costs to all of that are significant. So it's absolutely less expensive to keep people housed than to deal with all of the consequences for that family, for the community, for our country, if we allow evictions to go forward.
To say nothing, as you suggest, that it is with a virtual certainty likely to spread infection of COVID-19, as people don't always end up in a tent under the bridge. They often double and triple up at family and friends in a much more crowded space. Diane, you've made your adult's life purpose to advocating for affordable housing here after, I might note, an admirable nearly 4-year stint in the Peace Corps. How did you get into low-income housing advocacy? And why is it such a passion for you?
Well, after I was in the Peace Corps in rural Zambia for several years, I knew that I wanted to work on issues related to poverty. I mean, I saw just some of the deepest poverty I ever could have imagined and all of the impacts of it. So I knew that I wanted to work on poverty and I wanted to come back home to the US and work on it domestically. I went back to school and I got my master's in social work. And I started out actually thinking that I would want to do direct service or counseling with individual people. And I saw very quickly that for me, I would burn out very quickly on that because it was so obvious with all the people that I worked with that it was systemic. Their challenges were systemic, and the only help individually I could give would be Band-Aids. But what was really needed was systemic change to help all of the situations that low-income families were dealing with. One of the internships I had in graduate school was on a study of the impacts of welfare reform on mothers. And it was an ethnographic study, and I had 5 women, 5 moms, all of which were in, well, half of them were in affordable housing, half of them were in public housing, and the others were unsubsidized. And I would go to their homes every month and interview them and their children about different aspects of their lives. And it was so clear from the beginning and throughout the year-long study, the difference that having an affordable home had on every aspect of their lives. And the moms and the kids who lived in public housing had tremendous challenges too, because they were still very poor. but they always had that anchor of a home, and they knew it was safe. They knew they could afford it. They knew they weren't going to lose it the next month. The other moms weren't as lucky. They were in unsubsidized housing. They faced frequent evictions. The kids had to move schools, and it created tremendous challenges for them. So it's been clear to me ever since that time how essential a home, a stable, affordable, decent home is. And so I've worked immediately after graduate school. I worked at the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless and started doing housing policy advocacy there. I moved down to Washington, D.C. to take my first job at the National Low Income Housing Coalition as a policy analyst. And after several years, I moved on to HUD, and I directed the public housing management and occupancy division. Worked
What years were you at HUD?
I was there from 2000, I want to say 9 to 2011, I think. It was under the Obama administration. And then I was at Enterprise Community Partners, and then I had this incredible opportunity to come back to the National Income Housing Coalition. And for me, it really felt like full circle in coming back to, feels like everything that I've done up until this point has been to prepare for this work and for this job.
And you came back and started as CEO in what year?
It's been a little over 4 years now. So that was 2016.
Thank you. Lauren, next question.
Thank you. This question is coming from Paul, who is watching live. Clearly, rental assistance is important for both precarious renters as well as landlords, particularly mom and pop landlords. What can we do to ensure that Republicans in Congress who will have to vote for this understand that dual importance message? They care about small mom and pop business owners, e.g. these landlords. Property taxes paid by these landlords are so important to local school systems, firefighters, etc. Congressman Heck?
What was that individual's name?
Paul.
Paul, thank you very much for that question. Well, we've been doing our best, and Diane has been an absolute indispensable part of this, of building as broad and deep a coalition of support for rental assistance as possible. I'm very pleased that the version of the bill that I introduced in the House had not only the strong support of the chair of the Financial Services Committee, that's the Committee of Jurisdiction for Housing, referring, of course, to Congresswoman Maxine Waters, but 160 other members of the House of Representatives are co-sponsors. And indeed, you're hearing this number correctly, closing in on 1,000 organizations. I think last count we were at 950 different organizations throughout the country that are supportive. Along the way, we attracted the interest and the strong support and leadership for which we are so grateful of Senator Sherrod Brown, who is the ranking member of banking in the Senate, and that's the Committee of Jurisdiction. And so we have support in the Senate as well. But your question specifically is, what is it that we can do to turn the hearts of the Senate majority? And about the only thing I can think to say is, continue to beat this drum as loudly and strongly and clearly as we can. And I say this with some discomfort and pain, as the difficulty and the challenge and how very hard this recession we are in becomes more and more apparent as each day goes by, perhaps, if they hear from enough people, they'll be ready to be more receptive to what it is that we are saying is so desperately needed. But Diane, what would you add to that?
Well, I think I agree with that. And I think maybe you were saying this when I lost my internet. I think I heard you saying some of this when I came back on, but so forgive me if I'm repeating, but I think Paul makes a good point about the impact on small landlords. And we make a point to make the same case that emergency rental assistance is essential, not only to ensuring that we're not saddling low-income renters with more debt than they can possibly pay off through this pandemic, but also that we're not losing some of our country's essential housing stock. And small landlords can't continue to maintain and operate their properties if they don't have rental income coming in. So emergency rental assistance helps us avoid both harmful outcomes. It helps both low-income renters and small landlords. So, and I have found that is a compelling argument to Republicans. And there are apartment associations, the National Apartment Association, National Multifamily Housing Council, other organizations like that are also calling for at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, as your bill would provide. So there is our organizations don't always agree on everything that we advocate for, but this is a place where we can agree and say, yes, we need assistance for landlords and for low-income renters. And we are starting to see some Republicans in the Senate. They're not talking about it as publicly as the Democrats are, but certainly they recognize that they have to do something to prevent this wave of evictions in their state. And we are increasingly seeing some Republicans, we need more, but some Republicans starting to talk to leadership about the importance of protections for renters in this next spending bill.
We did a little bit of a deep dive on this subject, indeed, while you were out trying to fight back the storm that took your internet access away, Diane. I made the point that mom and pop landlords actually constitute about half of all ownership of residential units, but they are disproportionately represented among what we call Class C apartments, which means the very areas where there are a disproportionate number of people of lower income. So it's a double whammy if we don't get rent relief. It's a double whammy on people who can least afford it and who are most vulnerable, and a whammy as well, of course, on the mom and pop landlords. This has a consequence not just to them and the form of retirement security they chose to build over time, and which is now at risk through absolutely no fault of their own, but it is also a job issue, because we're talking about all of the people, this incredible housing ecosystem of maintenance people and repair people that keep these properties current throughout this country. We lose greatly across the board if we're not able to figure out how to get the Senate to come along with this. Lauren.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Britta from Olympia, who sent this in through constituent mail. I am a single mother that has worked very hard to bring in an income that doesn't require a 60-hour work week. I have 4 rental properties in Olympia, and I rely on that rent for my income. There has been so much talk about tenants' rights, but what about my rights? I have put all my money into these investment properties so I could be available to my children. I have not been given any help, and my tenants think they don't have to pay rent. How can they get all this help while I'm made to feel bad for owning rental homes? Congressman Heck?
Well, Britta, you shouldn't feel bad at all for meeting the most basic human need we have, that of shelter. I can't think of anything more important unless it would be air, water, and food. And you're actually meeting a need in the marketplace, and I thank you for doing that. This is precisely what we were just talking about. We need to provide rent relief, which, Britta, if we are successful, would be payments that go directly to you. And so we're going to continue to work on that. You're right to feel the way you do. You are a very important part of this, and we're going to keep fighting to see if we can accommodate it. And it looks as though the internet has kicked my friend Diane out yet again. So while we're waiting, we're cursed tonight, Lauren. We're cursed. While we're waiting to see if she can be brought back, were there any other questions that have been submitted?
We have one that's on a related topic from Denise in Olympia that was sent in through constituent mail. Please address the desperation of landlords of mother-in-law apartments and accessory dwelling units under the eviction moratorium. These are our homes, and we must have the ability to remove tenants when they turn out to be incompatible with the family in the main house, or if they don't pay rent. Is there any chance Congress will add exemptions to the moratorium for mother-in-law apartments and accessory dwelling units and landlords who only own one unit? You risk losing a lot of low-income housing if you don't give us an exemption.
Thank you for the question. It's the first I've heard of it. I guess rather than give you an uninformed off the top of my head or off the cuff response, I actually would like to go back and take a look at the language that we have had and give that some consideration. I want you to know how grateful I am to you for bringing this kind of new wrinkle to it. That's one of the advantages of having these kinds of conversations and providing you with opportunity to make points or ask questions as we get exposed to new information. And so I appreciate it. Thank you very much for bringing your perspective forward.
Thank you. In the meantime, we do have one more live question from Michelle, who is watching live on Facebook. Michelle wrote, HUD lets nonprofits do whatever they like with federal disaster housing funds. Local nonprofits.
Could you repeat the question? I missed the first part of it.
Yes. This is coming from Michelle. HUD lets nonprofits do whatever they like with federal disaster housing funds. Local nonprofits put unreasonable time limits on finding affordable housing. Then county nonprofits suck up and use those funds without accountability to FEMA or HUD for using them as intended. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, again, this is 2 in a row. First I've heard of it. What I would actually ask of you, and Lauren, I want you to be looking there for our office numbers, is for you to call our office and give a little bit more color and definition to some circumstance that you've observed, so that we can be better prepared to understand this. We're going to give you the number in a minute, but the best thing to do is call. And then I want you, did I understand that she was calling from Olympia? Is this Denise?
This is Michelle. I'm not sure where Michelle is calling from.
Okay. Well, then we're going to give you 2 numbers, Michelle. We'll give you one for the Pierce County area where we have an office, and we'll give you one for Olympia. And would very much appreciate it if you could call tomorrow or the next day when you have a minute and kind of describe the circumstance that you have seen in more detail so we can better understand and therefore be better prepared to seek a solution if one is possible. Lauren, do you have the numbers to share with Michelle?
Yes, our number for Thurston County is 360-459-8514. And the phone number for Pierce County is 253-533-8332. Thank you. We're still working on bringing Diane back. And in the meantime, we've gotten a couple of comments from Paul, who is both thanking you for the work that you are doing and also who says Peace Corps rocks. So hopefully Diane will come back and hear that as well.
Any other questions?
We have one question from Sarah, who asked, what about long-term solutions? How do we end the housing crisis once this pandemic is over?
Oh, Sarah, thank you for asking that question. So fundamentally, we have a housing supply shortage problem, and it's serious, and it exists in a lot of areas. It's not just in Seattle or densely populated urban areas. It's also in rural areas. It's in a lot of places throughout America. And so fundamentally, what we need to do is to build more houses. We especially need our housing units. When I say houses, I also mean housing units as may be contained within a multifamily dwelling or a condominium complex, for example. And we need to build more. As Diane suggested, her numbers say that we're about 7 million short just in the affordable housing market, which is to say that which would be available for lower income people. Indeed, we are 7.5 million plus. About the only part of the market that seems to be fully met is the higher end homes. People of means can always figure out a way to get access to a home, but when you start going down the income ladder or down the value of the home, it becomes more and more problematic, and especially so on the affordable end of housing. So one of the proposals that I have made, and I'm very excited about, I'm retiring at the end of this year from Congress, and people ask me all the time, am I going to miss it? And I tell them, not really, frankly. I'm looking forward to being home with my wife, Paula, frankly, and not being on an airplane flying cross country twice a week. But there are people I will miss, to be sure. Part of the process, however, that I will miss is the opportunity to work on this idea I've developed, and that, in fact, our intermittent guest tonight, Diane Yentel, has helped with, and that is a bill entitled Fulfilling the Promise of the Housing Trust Fund. We have a National Housing Trust Fund that is dedicated to helping construct more affordable housing. In the 10 plus years that it's existed, it has spent a pittance of amount of money. In fact, about $660 million. You spread that out across the country, it's nothing. I came up with an idea about how we might substantially increase that investment, substantially increase it without increasing taxes. And that was to go into the government-sponsored enterprises. You know them as Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. These are the federal entities that provide secondary liquidity in the housing market, and capture something called a G fee or a guarantee fee. Now, what is that? It's a tiny fee, 10 basis points, 0.01%, that is levied on transactions that go through these government-sponsored enterprises. It was adopted more than 10 years ago when we were in the Great Recession as a way of being a pay-for payroll tax cut. In other words, we cut payroll taxes, this was before I got here, as a way to stimulate the economy and to make sure that that cut in revenue didn't just increase the size of the deficit. They adopted a G fee. Well, a G fee has nothing to do with housing, and yet it is collected by the two largest housing entities on the face of the planet. And it is set to expire next year. And so I propose that rather than let it expire, this existing G fee simply be converted for the use of construction of affordable housing. And it would provide us with literally billions of dollars every year to construct new affordable housing. And once again, Diane Yentel returns. Diane, I was just describing for somebody who asked a question about when we get past the pandemic, how do we attack this shortage of affordable housing? And I was promoting awareness of my Fulfilling the Housing Trust Fund bill that I've introduced. And you need to know that the concept, the idea of capturing this G fee for this purpose, which would be the most significant investment in affordable housing in the history of our republic, was hatched literally in my office during a conversation with Diane Yentel last fall,
I think
last summer, last fall.
Yes. Right.
And so she's kind of the godmother of this idea. And I was suggesting, Diane, that we obviously have dim prospects at best to get that this year. And I really, really wish that I could be around to see that adopted, because it would do so much and make such a difference in increasing the stock of affordable housing and making a difference in people's lives.
It's tremendously important. Yeah, I remember that meeting well. It was your idea. I appreciate you calling me the godmother of the idea, but it was actually your idea.
You inspired me. You inspired me.
We were brainstorming, yes, and you and you just said, "Why don't we just do this? I'm going to introduce a bill," and then you did, and it's so badly needed. You know, the National Housing Trust Fund is one of a kind program in that it focuses entirely on building and making affordable apartments for the lowest income people, which are people with the greatest and the clearest and the most immediate needs. And building apartments that to try to alleviate this tremendous deficit of homes for the lowest income people is essential to ending the housing crisis and to ending homelessness. So I appreciate your work on that, and we certainly will be, after you have left Congress, we will certainly continue pushing that idea forward, and other ways to expand the Housing Trust Fund, because it's essential that we do.
Thank you.
Lauren.
This question comes from Donna, who is watching live. Can Congressman Heck speak to the idea of resident-owned cooperative housing? What can you or Ms. Yentel tell us about low-income individuals collectively purchasing real estate? Ms. Yentel?
I think it's a really important idea, and it's an important way to both continue to keep housing affordable for the long term and increase management and incomes for low-income people. Resident-owned cooperatives are, I wouldn't say they're quite common yet, but there are many instances and best practices to learn from where residents have worked together to take over, to own a property. Sometimes it's when the property is coming to the end of its affordability contract, and there's an option then for residents to step into the role of managing that property. And there are many cases of it working and working well. And it's another way to also ensure the long-term viability and the long-term affordability of those properties. So it's certainly an important tool that can be used.
Is this a growing phenomenon, Diane?
A growing phenomenon? I'd say there's certainly more interest in it and more support, I'd say, for finding ways to enable residents take on that leadership role and take on the ownership and the management of those properties. So yes, in some ways, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of policy change and even financing support that's needed to make it work. So there's still more to be done at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. But I'd say there's increased awareness and understanding of why this is an important tool that should be empowered and enabled.
Thank you. Lauren.
Thank you. That concludes our questions that we've received for the town hall, but I'll turn it back to you, Congressman Heck, if you have other questions you'd like to ask or closing thoughts.
I guess, Diane, I'd like for you to riff a little bit, if you could, on the most important steps that we could take. If I listen carefully enough to this conversation and you in the past, it seems like the two obvious ones are we got to get rent relief, number one, and number two, we got to figure out a way to make a massive increase in investment and in affordable housing. But are there other steps that are comparable in importance to you? And are there details about how to undertake either of those that you think are worth describing or mentioning?
Yeah, the most important things that we need to do right now are really quite simple, even if they're not easy, right? We need to protect, keep safe, and keep alive people who are experiencing homelessness during this pandemic. And then we need to ensure that nobody else becomes homeless during the public health emergency. It's really that simple and that urgent. And doing that requires that, one, Congress provide more resources. We're asking for at least $11.5 billion in resources for homeless shelter and service providers so that they can implement social distancing and they can get people who are homeless quickly housed. Then we have to stop anybody else from becoming homeless. And we do that through, one, implementing a uniform national moratorium on all evictions for non-payment of rent for the duration of the pandemic. You know, the very least the federal government ought to do in the middle of a public health emergency is ensure that none of us are going to lose our homes during it. But as we've talked about today, eviction moratoriums on their own aren't enough because eventually they expire, and we don't want to create a financial cliff for renters to fall off of when back rent is owed, and they're no more able to pay it then than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. And that's why at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance is essential. So keep people who are homeless safe and alive, get them quickly housed, and prevent anybody else from becoming homeless during the pandemic. But that's just to stop the tsunami of evictions that will otherwise come. We still haven't addressed the underlying causes of the affordable housing crisis that we were in even before COVID-19. And if we don't address that underlying shortage of homes for the lowest income people, we'll face this eviction crisis again during the next pandemic or the next wave of this pandemic, the next natural disaster, or even during the next year, because we haven't solved for the true issue here, which is the shortage of homes affordable for the lowest income people. And there too, the solutions, they're not easy, but they are simple. We need to build more apartments that are affordable to the lowest income people through programs like the National Housing Trust Fund. We need to make apartments affordable, the apartments that are on the private market affordable to low income people. And we do that by bridging the gap between what people earn and what rent costs through rental assistance like Section 8 vouchers. We need to reduce restrictive zoning that inhibits the supply of any housing, and especially affordable housing, which drives up costs for everybody, which is another bill that Congressman Heck has introduced. I don't know if you've talked about that one yet, but it's also—
You're talking about YIMBY.
The YIMBY, right? We have to reduce all these. We have to remove all this restrictive zoning that doesn't allow for any apartments to be built in some communities, and then we have to have cash assistance in eviction prevention to help people who can otherwise generally make ends meet absorb a financial shock and stay housed. And you know, the thing about homelessness and housing poverty in our country is that it's a public policy choice to allow it to persist. As a country, we choose to allow homelessness and we choose to allow housing poverty, and we could choose otherwise. You know, we have the data, we have the solutions. Certainly as a country.
She froze yet again.
Once more. We have had 2 more questions
Once
come
more.
in the meantime. So if I can take this moment to ask them of you, Congressman Heck. The first
Sure.
question comes from Antoinette and was asked by a live viewer. What about more affordable single-family homes?
Thank you, Antoinette. We're not building enough of them. As a matter of fact, if you look at construction patterns, what builders are interested in, obviously, are profits. And they're not going to build a home that they lose money on. It has gotten to the point where it is very difficult to build a starter home and still gain a profit. And that's why you see them building bigger and more expensive homes, because they're more profitable to them. One of the causes for that, frankly, are the fees that municipalities have levied or that voters have approved, and all for very good purposes. But the fact of the matter is it burdens the cost of purchase of a starter home. In my hometown of Olympia, it's estimated that at least $40,000 is required before you turn a shovel of dirt. And that's whether you're building a small 700 square foot home or a 3,200 square foot home. Obviously, the profit's going to be in the larger home. So that's one of the things that we have to deal with. Diane alluded to the exclusionary zoning that makes it more difficult to build more densely for affordable housing. I also think that the maybe one thing on the laundry list that she left off was why it is this country is spending billions, tens of billions every year in the construction of mass transit. Why we don't make it a requirement or certainly incentivize the construction of housing near mass transit, especially light rail and the like. Because the truth of the matter is, these things are all interrelated. It's an ecosystem, and each of these factors impinges upon one another. It is also the object of legislation that's been introduced in Congress, principally by Scott Peters of San Diego. I probably am a co-sponsor of that bill, to encourage the Federal Department of Transportation to incentivize the construction of housing near transit. So those are just some of the ideas, Antoinette, that we've kicked around and actually developed and introduced. As we often say about problems, we didn't get into this fix overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. I happen to personally always think that the best place to start is a common understanding of what the problem is. And the problem statement's pretty clear. We have a serious housing supply shortage in this country. It is acute at the affordable housing level. And we're going to need to attack it in a multifaceted way and in a comprehensive way. And we're going to also have to attack it at the local, the state, and the federal level. No one level of government is going to solve this.
Thank you.
Lauren?
And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to bring Diane back on the line. So that does conclude our questions for this evening, but I will turn it back over to you for any closing thoughts or remarks.
Well, my first obvious remark is please accept our apologies for the technical difficulties. That's the first time in 17 town halls that we've had that much difficulty. Diane is in another part of Washington, D.C. than I am, and she said she was experiencing severe storms, and I think that's accountable for the interruption of her service on those several occasions. So we're sorry for that. We do want you to know that my passion for housing extends into our next teletown hall. In fact, on August 5th, which is a week from tomorrow, I'll be talking with Maureen Fife. She's the head of Pierce County Habitat for Humanity. That's one of the organizations that is seeking to meet this need of affordable housing in a unique way, and on not just a national, but an international basis. And there are heartwarming success stories left and right. I know I've been on those job sites many times. So between now and then, be well, stay safe, mask up, wash your hands, stay socially distant, and know how very grateful I am that you are indeed giving of your most precious commodity, your time. Good night.